Hello, and welcome to the July edition of the Nutritionist Webinar 2016. I am Mary Ann Fessenden from Agricultural Modeling and Training Systems and serve as your English language host. These webinars provide access to technical seminars by internationally recognized speakers. The series presentations are held in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. The presenters are hosted by AMTS in the United States, while Marcos Neves Pires from 3R Labs simultaneously translates in Portuguese for Brazil, and Paula Torillo translates into Spanish for Argentina. There will be a post-presentation question and answer period during which listeners can submit questions through me or Marcelo and Paula. A complete recording of archived webinars as well as the question and answer session for each will be available on the 3R and AMTS website. We are very pleased and honored to have Dr. Mike VanAmburgh here today as our presenter. Mike is a presenter in the Department of Animal Science at Cornell University, where he has a dual appointment in teaching and research. His undergraduate degree is from The Ohio State University, and his PhD is from Cornell University. Mike currently leads the development of the Cornell Net Carbohydrate and Protein System, or Cncps, a nutrition evaluation and formulation model used worldwide, and through that effort is focused on enhancing the efficiency of nutrient use by ruminants to improve the environmental impact of animal food production. He has co-authored and authored over 70 journal articles and many conference proceedings. A sought-after advisor, Mike is the recipient of several awards, including the Teaching and Mentoring Award from ADSA, the AFIA Award for Research, the CALS Professor of Merit Award, and the CALS Distinguished Advisor Award. I had a lot more to say, but Mike said just get on with it. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mike and unmute him, and he will do his thing. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mary. So I was asked to talk about heifers tonight, and I'm going to do several different aspects to it. I'm going to do a little bit of it as it relates to modeling, but then I want to tie it all together as it relates to things that I see happening in the dairy industry, at least here in North America. But I think it's probably, given what I know, it's probably applicable to other. I think where I want to start is here, and that is, sorry, I just needed to get my bearings straight, the need and importance for monitoring body weight gain and body weight to calving. This has become, as we've made the model more sophisticated, and again, so right up front I'm going to talk about the Cncps. As we've made the model more sophisticated on many levels in terms of how we describe rumen function, ME supply, MP supply, it's made the model more sensitive to lots of other inputs. And today's focus is on heifers, but an interesting parallel is, there's a lot of cows in the Northeast that are whose diets are formulated with the Cncps. And the latest release of 6.55, we slowed the passage rate down to account for some of the energy that we were not predicting in things like dry cows, pasture-fed cows, and heifers. But that also impacted the predictions of energy and metabolizable protein in lactating cows in ways that I don't think everybody was ready for. And what's happened is, as soon as we released 655 and it was implemented in AMTS, so everybody was using it, what happened was my phone started to ring, and I received a bunch of emails about how poorly the model was now predicting energy, amino acids, and that some of the some of the things that people had relied on relative to the model had now changed, and they didn't know what to do. And after lots of conversation and emails and discussions, what I realized is people were really just guessing at the body weight of the animals they were formulating for. So one of the big pushes that I have now in terms of model training, which falls right into this topic of heifers, is we need to figure out, if you want to balance lactating cow diets at grams of amino acids, You want to know how many grams of methionine or lysine you have to feed. We have to be closer than 200 or 300 pounds of body weight on the animals, right? And this is a really important point. And so what's the most important input really in the model? And this is in any model. And I think, there's many times when I've worked with nutritionists and rode with nutritionists, and they'll tell me, I can't get the cow's prediction of intake and the actual intakes to line up. In almost every case, it's because they haven't put in the right body weight, okay? And this is old school. This might sound like a throwback, but it's really becoming one of those things that, as I said, as we increase the precision and the accuracy of the model, these inputs become much more important in the prediction of the outcome. And the reason body weight's so important is because we use it for all these things, right? We use it to predict feed intake. We use it to predict, we're talking about feed intake, we're talking about maintenance, we're talking about whether it's activity, there's a certain energy requirement for that. That's all going to be a function of body weight. Our protein maintenance requirements, passage rates. People, said to me for a long time, you guys have to fix your passage rates. We have to improve the passage rates. Well, we've improved the passage rates, and now that we have, it's actually working much better. But the opportunity now is we have to get better. We have to get better data for our body weights. We have to start monitoring that, and that's true for the lactating cows, but it's also true for the heifers, and it's probably more true for the heifers than the lactating cows because that's our only reference of performance, right? And it comes down to predicting growth requirements. People ask me now or tell me, hey, Mike, I'm using the model, but I'm getting fat heifers. There's two things I think of. The first thing I think of is, do you actually know what they're consuming for feed? And the second thing that I have is, do you actually know what their body weight is and have any indication of performance? Because if they're getting fat, it means they're getting more energy than they need or they require, and at least for your objective growth, but you don't really know. Pregnancy is tied to body weight, reserve requirements all tied to body weight. It's used everywhere, and it's incredibly sensitive as we've made these changes to the model. So coming back to the heifers, how do we use this information? Well, the first thing is we gotta have some benchmarks. So these benchmarks came about from a 1999 publication, Dan Fox, Tom Taluki, and myself. And not all of these numbers were in there. At the time, we weren't playing with birth to weaning, not that we have a model for that yet. That's still on my to-do list. But, we want to double the body weight from birth to weaning. Puberty is going to happen somewhere around 45% of mature body weight. You want to get them pregnant somewhere between 55 and 60% of mature weight, right? Some of the data coming out of Europe would suggest 65% is probably okay, 65 to 70 is probably okay. My proactive nature in terms of management would say I don't want to wait until 65 to 70%. If you could be pregnant by then, that's fine. I want to start somewhere in that 55 to 60% range, partly because we don't spend time figuring out when they hit that. We're really bad at guessing that weight, and we validated that a few weeks ago with a model training session here at Cornell where just about everybody was off by a couple hundred pounds, and they were light. The heifers were much heavier than they were guessing. And so that means we've got to make sure we're starting early enough so after a service or two, they are pregnant by that 65%. These numbers are designed to optimize first lactation milk yield, and that comes from data from our group here at Cornell, and then Alex Bach in Spain generated a similar data set, completely different approach, and his breakpoint on mature weight post-calving, we have 82 to 85. His was 81, so 82 is our threshold. That's the number we came up with. The Dairy NRC committee picked 85 to be more conservative. bottom line is that pregnant somewhere around 60% of mature weight, post-calving body weight around 82% of mature body weight of the herd. How do you get the mature body weight? You need third and fourth lactation cattle. Third lactation cattle will be 96% of their mature weight. Fourth lactation cattle should be what they're going to be for maturity. They should have, if there's any fourth lactation cattle remaining in a herd, they should be as big as they're ever going to get. And they should, you want to get them 80 to 200 days in milk, healthy cows, not cull cows. Cull cows are not going to be indicative of what the rest of the herd looks like. Okay. So we're going to do a little bit of modeling now. So we sent the benchmarks. We're going to come back to them and work from them through the rest of the presentation. So here's to what would be considered Angus cattle. The one on the left is what would we consider to be an Angus, a modern Angus. It's all black, so it counts as an Angus. On the right would be what I would consider the traditional Angus cow. More of what you would have seen 40, 50, 60 years ago, and what you would still see if you went over to Europe. The question is, do you believe they have the same growth requirements for growth at a given weight? Almost everybody shakes their head and says no, because they're two very different animals. So my question then, or the challenge is, once you adjust or account for current body weight and maintenance requirements, is a kilo of gain for these two animals about the same amount of energy and protein? And the answer to that is yes. Okay? And I think this is where we're making some mistakes, and this is why the recommendations for heifers are also as a percent of mature size, because we can scale this using modeling techniques, and this is where body weight comes into play to help predict body composition as a function of stage of growth. What we tend to do, and this diagram kind of just loosely represents, I think, what happens in the industry. We're doing better, but we're still not getting body weights. So for the most part, we tend to formulate diets at a constant body weight. So I can go to a herd near Ithaca here that has, heifers that average 350 to 400 pounds, and I can make a diet for them that I really like. And, as a nutritionist, it's real simple. I like this diet. I'm going to go to the next farm 10 miles down the road, and I got the same kind of pen of animals, and I'm going to implement the same diet because they all weigh 350 to 400 pounds. However, and that's basically saying we're going to do this based on the same weight, right? Because that's generally how we assume that animal requirements fit. The reality is that the animal here, this 1,400 pound mature body weight animal, is different than this animal that's going to 1,800 pounds, even though they weigh 400 pounds. All right, the animal here, this animal at this intersection, is more physiologically mature, so she's going to have a slightly different body composition. She's going to contain more fat, a little less protein. Her protein requirement may be the same, but her energy requirement is going to be slightly different. This animal here is farther away from its mature size, thus physiologically it's a younger animal. Therefore, it's going to have a higher protein requirement and a slightly different energy requirement. So what we do now is, instead of looking at these animals at the same body weight, what we really should be thinking about is how do we describe them at the same percent of mature size. So at this intersection and this intersection, roughly, they're the same distance from maturity, which means compositionally a unit of gain should be the same energy requirement or nutrient requirement once I adjust for the difference in the maintenance requirement due to the difference in body weight. Okay, so, and we can see that here. This is a information. So this is very old data. Fortin had compiled this when this concept of how do we scale for empty body weight comes into play. So you can see here the range in cattle, we've got Angus heifers to Holstein bulls, but we can pick 15% empty body weight, right? So I can put them all on the same compositional basis. So the Angus heifer has a 15% empty body weight here. So she's roughly 150 kilos. I think I already drew lines on this. Whereas you get the same thing here, and she's this bull's 15% empty body weight. They're both at 15% empty body weight, or empty body fat. Sorry, I was interrupted there. You got 15% empty body fat at 150 kilos or at 400 kilos of body weight, roughly, right? Their requirements for growth are going to be the same. Okay? So once we understand that and we can scale for that, and that's all a function of their mature size and where they're going in their trajectory towards maturity, their chemical maturity, once we know that, we can make that adjustment. Now we can calculate everybody on the same basis. This all comes out of the 84 NRC system. It's based on the California Net Energy system, used to adjust all mature sizes to a standard reference animal by size scaling. The reference animals are 478 kilos or 1,054 pounds and 28% empty body fat. That's the percent empty body fat in this country of the animal that's harvested at the greatest quantity or the greatest number, so we know the most about them. So that's where this comes from. We can apply the same thing to heifers, and this is what Tom and Danny and I did in that 89 paper. And part of this was really out of some of Tom's PhD work. We were trying to figure out how to better come up with some of these numbers. So what you end up with is you scale the heifers on the same basis, equivalent shrunk weight. So you use the mature shrunk weight, which is this here, divided into the standard reference weight, and then you use the actual shrunk body weight. Shrunk body weight is basically a 15-hour fast and overnight fast. And when we do that to get rid of the variation in the calculations due to intake or fill, right? So we adjust all these based on the size of the herds you're working with. And I think that's a really important point, and I'm not sure if I've added the slides to that, but all Holsteins are not the same size. All Jerseys are not the same size herd to herd. All right, there's a lot of environmental influence there, so we need to know this on a herd-by-herd basis if we're talking about heifers. So then what we can do, this is the calculation for retained energy, where we have our coefficient, we have empty body weight to the 3/4 power, and we have empty body weight gain to just over 1. And instead of using the empty body weight, we use that equivalent empty body weight to adjust the composition to get a better prediction for retained energy relative to mature size, okay? And we can do the same thing for the protein gain. So we can calculate the net protein and stick in that adjusted retained energy, okay? So that actually tends to clean up the predictions quite a bit and makes the model more robust, but it means that you've got to know something about the mature size of the cows you're working with. This is true of all beef cows, but it's obviously true for the dairy animals. If the equivalent empty body weight is less than 478, we use this equation where we've got an adjustable efficiency. Otherwise, once you get closer to maturity, we have another set of equations that we use. We just use the equivalent empty body weight to get at the protein requirement. This part of the model probably requires a little bit more evaluation. Some of our more recent evaluations of the prediction of the gain for protein or the requirements for protein says that we need to go back and do some refinement. Using the standard reference weight based on a beef animal makes some sense, but there's more protein in the dairy animals, even at the intercept. So we've got a slight bias in the prediction of protein, and we know that it's one of the next things we're going to fix. But for the most part, it works remarkably well as long as you know something about the current weight and the mature weight. And then we get to the shrunk weight gain. So all of these equations, and we've got the standard equation here for shrunk weight gain. what we do then is we stick in the equivalent weight in place of that, and again, that cleans up the prediction because it standardizes it to the size of the animal that you're going to observe on the farm that you're working with. So this is why getting these mature weights and body weights is so important, because the predictions of the model are very sensitive to these outputs, and even the prediction of daily gain is going to be biased if you don't have the right inputs. Okay, so this is why we need to get better data for these heifers. This is an example just using a pen of heifers. So what I have here is the mature body weight at 1,400 pounds. This group of animals is currently 375 pounds and they're 4 months of age. We implement the target growth system, so we're targeting 22 months age of first calving, which means we need to get them pregnant by about 770 pounds given their mature weight. To meet that 22 months, they have to be pregnant by 13 months, and 82% of this 1,400 pounds is going to be about 1,190, 1,200 pounds, right? The diet here is not really that relevant. The most important thing is that we're balancing for that mature weight of 1,400 pounds. So to my earlier example, maybe I was balancing a diet for that group of animals somewhere close here to Ithaca, and I use that diet. I'm balanced at 1.8 pounds of ME allowable gain and 1.8 pounds of MP allowable gain. Everything looks good. I go down the road to feed the same size heifer. They're all 375 to 400 pounds. I feed them for a while. Things aren't working right. I start to ask some questions, and I realize that herd has a mature size of 1,800 pounds. I plug in 1,800 pounds, and the prediction all of a sudden on the same animals changes for the ME allowable gain to 2.15 or 2.2, or about a kilo a day. So the question is, why did that change? If all I did was change mature size, and that animal still weighs 375 to 400 pounds, why did the energy allowable gain prediction increase for that animal? And it goes back to that graphic example I gave you earlier, where this animal actually is now physiologically younger. It has a higher protein requirement, but protein is going to bring along more water. So you're going to get at least 3 units of water for every unit of protein, which means you're going to get better feed efficiency. And the equation actually knows how to account for that, because it recognizes, based on its construction, that it should see a higher rate of gain because they should be a leaner animal bringing along more water. The penalty is, if I allow that diet to continue to be used and I haven't made any changes, I'm now underfeeding protein. This is how I think we get fat. This is one of the ways we get fat heifers, is that if we know what they're consuming, but we haven't established the frame size of the animal, we may be achieving a certain energy allowable gain. We're probably limited their gain, but we're not feeding them enough protein to meet the requirement at that stage of growth. All right, so they're going to get fat over time. You do this for a few days, not a big deal. But you do it for an extended period of time, and now we're going to get fat heifers. All right, so knowing the mature size of the herd is really important for getting these calculations in line, okay, or else you're going to get biased predictions. Said the penalty would be for the larger mature size heifer, not enough MP compared to the energy allowable gain, most likely going to get fat. What I do know is that this can happen as early as the milk feeding phase, and if it starts, because I've had some people ask me, can I just, instead of feeding a higher protein milk replacer to get higher growth, can I just feed a 20/20 and more of it? And the answer is, yeah, you can feed more of a 20/20, but the energy to protein relationship isn't correct. So that animal's, if you're going to double the amount of 20/20 milk replacer that you're feeding, you're actually going to get more energy than protein, and you're going to potentially get the animal fat. And it can compound itself over the life of the animal. You can do all the equations, right? And I've laid that all out here. I'm not going to walk through all the math, right? But I wanted everybody to have it to see how this works. The most important point about this slide and the next slide is down here at the bottom. So this is the integration of the requirements for energy with agent first calving, using the target growth system as it is in the model, and adjusting for the standard reference animal, so adjusting for the mature size and getting it right. So if I do that for this particular group of animals, what it says is my energy requirement to achieve the growth that I want is about 2.2 mcals per day. All right? Well, what happens if I don't meet that, or what happens if I don't make any adjustment for mature weight? And what happens is we end up with a prediction of 2.7 mcals per day. All right, so we're going to overfeed energy about half an mcal per day by not getting that body composition predicted correctly because we didn't use the appropriate mature size. Now, over time, that's half an mcal per day of energy they don't need. You're going to end up with a fat heifer at the end of the process if this is a long, you're in this for the long run. And that's where I think some of the fat heifer issues are coming from that I hear about right now. And again, partly it's because we're just not monitoring at any stage of growth, but especially we're probably grossly underestimating the mature weight of the cows we're working with. In the training session we had a month ago here, we took everybody out to the research farm, and we had them write down the weights, and then we gave them the weights, and consistently most people were 250, 300 pounds off on the body weight of the herd. Right? It was quite remarkable. So we're not good at guessing this. We got to get scales. Given the value of a scale, or the cost of a scale, and the value of the herd that we're working with, and the feed intake, and the productivity, scales a pretty inexpensive investment. The labor is a little bit more, but this explains why we're so worried about going back to some of the basics and getting some of this information, because at this point the model is very sensitive to these types of inputs. Here's a body composition data set from Matt Meyer, his PhD, and this is we went out and we purchased these heifers from local herds. We were looking at mammary development. We couldn't afford to harvest all the heifers from the research farm. We wouldn't have anything to milk for a year. But what we did is, not only were we looking at mammary development, we also did all the body composition work. And you can see here, what we did is we predicted the retained energy, or the net energy for gain, those interchangeable here, versus what we observed. And you can see that, the R squared looks reasonable at 80, but the slope, is 1.35, which means that as we went to higher levels of retained energy, we had a 35% bias in the prediction of retained energy when we did not adjust for mature size, and you can see that here in these residuals. All right, we went out to the population that we purchased the animals from, and we taped. We couldn't weigh them all, but we taped all the mature animals we can find, and you'll see that these were not really big cows in the herds from which we purchased these animals. They weighed on average about 1,440 pounds, which is not really that heavy by today's standards. But when we take that data and we plug it in to the same predictions, all of a sudden, the R squared doesn't change much, but the slope goes to 1. All right. Bottom line is that when we adjust for the mature weight of the cattle that we're doing these predictions on, as long as we know something about the heifers, at least their body weight, we can predict their retained energy and predict their energy requirements for growth with pretty high precision. But it's all relative to what other information we have, right? And mature body weight really plays a big part in that. Okay, so just to walk you through some of the modeling aspects of what we're doing. Body condition score guidelines. At some point, everybody asks the practical questions. We do all the big hand waving on the modeling. Well, I get them pregnant, come back to that, pregnant at 55% of mature body weight, body condition score, somewhere around a 3 on a 5-point scale. Post-calving, we want to be that 82%, and again, somewhere between 3.5 and 3.75 on a 5-point scale. So we're still trying to manage those heifers to make sure they don't get fat. So these are the more practical targets. Obviously, though, at some point, you got to know something about the body weight. But even if you know the body weight, you got to still manage the body condition score. Troubleshooting growth problems in the Cncps. This hasn't changed much in years. I've added a couple. But, incorrectly accounting for the following inputs will basically cause problems with prediction. So number one on the list is lack of a current or previous body weight. Right? If you don't really know what they weigh, you're probably going to get a biased response or biased prediction. If you don't know the mature body weight, it's an incorrect mature body weight, as I just showed you. If you don't know the mature body weight, all bets are off on everything because you're just not going to get it right. Differences between expected and actual intake. How many people actually know what their growing animals, what their heifers are consuming? The incorrect chemical composition of the feed, right? This one's getting a little better, but there's still times where people don't really know what they fed their heifer. Not only do they not know what they consume, they don't really know what the chemical composition of it was, especially if it was a refusal from the lactating cows. And then incorrect maintenance calculation. This is the one that I see. This past winter wasn't too bad up here in the Northeast. The previous 2 winters were just terrible, were brutally cold. Heifers really took a hit, and we just didn't adjust energy values, and we couldn't adjust intakes anymore, but we just didn't adjust energy values of the diets to give them enough nutrients, and we lost a bunch of growth. And again, partly that's because we just weren't monitoring, but incorrect maintenance calculation, that could be because of activity, could be because of environmental temperatures, things like that. But that's one of the big issues. And then transitory effect of previous plan of nutrition, right? Were they in a situation where they were out on a pasture, it was late August, could be here right now, this part of the country, we've had less than half an inch of rain in the last month where I live. So grass is brown, alfalfa is brown, corn is turning brown. If you're a pasture-fed animal right now, you're probably pretty lean, and the moment that you're going to get some good nutrients, you're going to compensate like crazy. So transitory effect of previous plan of nutrition will play into this incorrect thing, and it's hard for us. We don't know how to predict compensatory gain at this point. All right, someday maybe we'll figure out how. All right, why don't we take some questions here, Mary Ann? That was an awful lot, and people might have some intermediate questions.
Okay. I have a question to start with from Mark Stocking. When evaluating a particular pen of heifers, let's say a 12 to 18-month pen with a weight range of 800 to 1,100 pounds, where would you put an average weight for the pen? And if the audience wants to go ahead and type some questions in the Q&A section, we can take them right now. Otherwise, we'll answer that one. So,
Mark, I would answer your question with a question back just for clarity. I'm assuming these are all pregnant animals, and I'm assuming that the pregnant animals stay together until at least the 3rd trimester.
Yes, they are all pregnant animals.
Okay. So if they're all pregnant animals, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick probably an animal that's going to be about 950 to 1,000 pounds. And I'm going to make sure that she's characterized in her 2nd trimester of pregnancy, because the energy's a little easier to hit here than the protein is for a mixed group like this, for the most part. And I'm probably going to ask some questions about, where they're at relative to how I can feed them. So when I see pens like this, as long as they're not tremendously overcrowded, and they got plenty, if they've got bunk space, I'm probably going to dial in my predicted intakes to be 2 to 3 pounds at least at least 5 to 8% below what I know they can consume. So I'm going to control their intakes. I'm not going to limit them. I'm going to feed a high forage diet, but I am going to be close to that 1,000 pounds. What I do want to do, though, so the protein requirement for those animals, you could probably get the model to predict that protein requirement at sub 12. I would tell you never to do that because they're going to run out of nitrogen to keep the rumen nitrogen level happy, and it probably isn't predicting that exactly like that, but 12% would be the bottom. But what I want everybody to do is I want you to go to 195 days pregnant. I'm going to talk about this later, and make sure that when they hit the third trimester, you got plenty of protein there to meet that requirement. Because in a mixed group like this, it's very possible that you could underestimate the protein requirement when you get to that point. So I'm going to be on the slight higher side of that 800 to 1,100, somewhere around 1,000, and I'm going to test the pregnancy status.
Okay, Mike, I don't have any more questions right now.
So I'll keep going.
Okay, thanks.
So I already kind of talked about the benchmarks, right? And I won't spend a lot of time on this. You know, we did this already. Where this came from was here, right? So we did a bunch of statistical modeling. We used the same kind of mathematical procedure to get this data that sire analysts would use to get a predicted transmitting ability or a heritability. And that's why you see this term residual milk here on the side. And what we did with this research project, when our hypothesis didn't quite work the way we thought, we found some variation in milk production that we didn't understand, and where the variation in milk production came out, and this was not part of our hypothesis, was this percent of mature size. Right, so you could go all the way to 90% of mature size, and you're going to optimize your milk yield, but the amount of time it's going to take you to go from 82, where it wasn't statistically different, to 90 is not worth the effort because you can't recover it in enough increased milk yield. So the break point that we identified was about 82% of the mature size of the herd, and again, that's the same kind of data, done in a different way, but that's the same kind of data that Alex Bach identified in his work in Spain. So this is where this comes from. You can see, though, that it starts to peel off, and there's a whole other talk, right? So the percent where percent of mature size or first lactation milk yield is optimized is somewhere between 82 and 85. I've said all that already, but the bottom line is that we feel very comfortable with that. But it is a bit of a problem right now because people aren't monitoring that, and they're not finding the milk, right? And it lends to a table like this where you can come up with target growth rates and benchmarks based on the mature weight of the herd, because these guys are all the same percent mature size, and there's several stories related to this and trying to diagnose performance. I'll just say that in every time we can get enough data and we can do these kinds of calculations relative to percent mature size, we can explain away a lot of the variation in first lactation milk yield, because they're always going to prioritize nutrient growth and use of nutrients for growth over lactation to try to get to that 92, 93% of mature body weight by the second lactation. So, right, and here's a simple example of that. And every herd's going to have a standard deviation, right? So when we were doing this work at Cornell years ago, this was a study where we knew everything about these heifers. We were bleeding them weekly. We set it up to calve at 22 months. The mature side of the herd was 1474 plus or minus 120. We needed to calve at about 1209. We started getting them pregnant about 811, which was 55% of them. We want to get them pregnant by 811. We started breeding by 750. To make sure that we achieved that. We knew exactly when they all became pubertal because we had blood samples. We did a study looking at CLA, and CLA didn't mean anything in the milk outcome. So you can see the number of heifers here. You can see their average daily gain. You can see that we targeted 22 months, and we basically hit that. We hit the targets for growth, or body weight at calving. These are the actual days in milk. Not days in milk. These are the days milked, not days in milk. These are the days milked. Very short lactations. They got the heifers bred almost too fast after they calved in. but their milk yield was not significantly different. There was no treatment effect. And because there was no treatment effect, I took this opportunity to explore the variation associated with body weight. Since we had measured everything about these, and there was no treatment effect, I looked at it in a different way. So here's the age of first calving. We've got animals calving at less than 21 months, 22 to 23, which was our target, and then greater than 23 months. And you can see we had 19, 27, and 19. Well, the standard deviation around the mature size was 120. On a percentage basis, that standard deviation is going to carry through the whole growth cycle. So what you're looking at is the standard curve, or the bell-shaped curve, around the population of animals. We were targeting our mean, that's here. We got the majority of the animals on the mean. We've got the larger mature framed heifers here from the larger mature cows, and the smaller, so 1470 plus or minus 120. The smaller mature frame animals grew faster at about 2.2 pounds. The average grew about 2 pounds a day. That was our target, and just under 2 for the large mature frame. But because the smaller mature frame animals hit puberty earlier, because they're smaller animals, they calved at 20 months. These guys calved on average about 22. These guys calved about 24. You can see their body weight ranges, 1180, 1220, 1313. Days in milk are not different. Milk production is not different. Okay? So in this particular situation, sticking to the target growth approach, age at first calving across this within her data set varied by 4 months, or was different by 4 months. We had differences in body weight, right? But milk production was not different because, and this basically to me says, hey, every herd is going to have a standard deviation around it. All heifers are going to come from different size mothers, but on average, we've got a population that we work towards, and as long as we understand that population and we work to implement these concepts, that we actually can reduce the difference in milk production based on age at first calving, because we're sticking to what we know about the population of the herd we're working with, right? Because it's really a function of physiological maturity and nothing else, okay? So that's why we're so, one of the reasons that we're so focused on making sure that we understand the population of cows that we're working with. It's not just to meet the maintenance requirements or the energy requirements that keeps them from getting fat. It's actually to set them all up so when they hit lactation, we can optimize first lactation milk yield no matter where they end up. With Mark's question, he asked about, how do I characterize those heifers? One of the things I'm always going to do is I'm always going to think about pregnancy in those heifers. And you can see in this, this is ME requirement in mCals per day, and this is day of pregnancy. And what I want to draw your attention to is at the beginning of the third trimester is when this really turns on, and you can see what the present data looks like. And that present data is actually this line right here, and you can notice that there's nothing over here. There's no slope. It's not either of these two curvilinear lines. It's literally this line here. There's really not much of a fetal requirement for energy or pregnancy requirement for energy until they hit the third trimester, and then it just really turns on and it heads up towards about 6 mCals per day. And lots of previous NRCs tried to predict these different responses, and it's really just that discrete. It's a very funny thing. I remember the day that Alan Bell figured this out when he was here at Cornell, and he was very frustrated because he didn't think anything in biology would behave that way, right? But that's how it happens. And the protein requirement does the same thing. It's just basically you hit that third trimester and off it goes. So what I always encourage people to do is when you're putting together diets for heifers and you have pregnant heifers and they're going to stay there in that group until they hit the third trimester, you always want to make sure that you've evaluated that diet to meet the requirements for that pregnancy, given that, 50% of the glucose is going to come from amino acids. The requirement for protein, this is absorbed protein, it goes way up about that time. And the other thing to keep in mind here is when you look at fetal growth requirements, all right, here's two different animals, but you see growth rates of a pound a day basically through that last trimester, and this is just fetal growth. This doesn't include the weight of the placenta and the amniotic fluid and things like that. It's not the gravid uterus. If you put that in there, you actually find, total uterus growth rate of about 664 grams per day, so about 1.3, 1.4 pounds per day. So to that point, if you're taping animals, you don't detect that weight. But if you're putting third trimester animals over a scale, you register them as growing at 600 to 700 grams a day, what you're really measuring is just fetal growth, and what it says is that mom's not growing. So another point about monitoring is to be ready for that if you actually do start weighing them. I've had dairy producers call me and say, hey, my pregnant heifers are gaining 3 pounds a day. There's something wrong with them. Why are they doing that? And basically what it says is they're growing 1.5 pounds a day, and the fetus and gravid uterus is growing about 1.5 pounds a day. So they're doing exactly what you want them to do. But when you recognize that weight gain by putting them over a scale, it causes people to stop and think about what's really going on, and it usually scares some nutritionists and some dairy producers. So I throw this information up there because I think we forget about this, and I've seen a lot of heifers in situations where this wasn't considered, and they're really protein deficient, so they're not growing in that last trimester. They're actually not developing an appropriate mammary gland, and they're not making enough colostrum. So there's some downsides to this, not only it persists into the calf. All right. The other thing, I just talked about this, so we got to make sure we meet the requirements for pregnancy. And I just did this quick example. Everybody can see it. So here's a 550 kilogram, 830 kilogram mature body weight animal, 180 days pregnant at the end of the second trimester. And we got 1.4 kilos a day of energy allowable gain and 1.9 kilos a day of protein allowable gain. All right, this is just an example. I move them to 200 days pregnant, and the energy allowable gain goes down to 1.2, and the MP allowable gain goes to 0.93, and that's the only change I've made, just to give everybody an example of how much of an impact that has on the requirements. We went from 1.9 kilograms of allowable gain for MP to 0.9, so we lost a kilogram of allowable gain just by moving to the third trimester, okay? So if you've got diets that are really marginal on protein just above the requirements, you could have very deficient heifers at this point. So I just want to make that characterization because I think sometimes we miss that. Also, there's an increase in requirement for mammogenesis. This really doesn't turn on until 21 days prior to calving. But again, sometimes we don't really know when heifers got pregnant. I've seen some heifers get caught not really meeting not only the third trimester requirement for pregnancy, but continuing on and missing this part if they didn't get their days pregnant characterized properly. So there is an increased requirement for mammogenesis. It gets to about 277 grams of additional MP per day to meet that requirement for growth. Okay, probably not going to have enough time to get through all this, so I'm going to hit the high points. I call this the value-added section. I'm going to reinforce this. Man, we got to figure out how to get our heifers weighed. And knowing something about the herd is important. This is body weight and body condition score. I'm going to focus on body weight. This is our research farm, okay? And credit to Sam Fessenden, as part of his PhD, we needed to characterize all these cows because he was trying to precisely estimate the amino acid requirements for cows and the flows. What I want you to see here is this. here's our mature weight. I showed you earlier that the mature weight of our herd was 1474. That was 20 years ago. It's 1710. Our cows have gotten quite big. We've done a lot to change the cows, not so much with genetics, just in feeding and management, because we fed our calves better and we did lots of other things. But cows have gotten remarkably large, and this is not unusual. And the other thing that I want everybody to see is that the range in the size of the cows in the herd, 1,350 to 2,200. Not that we have that many down around 1,350, but I think what I'm trying to show you guys is that when you start looking at this and really understanding herds, there's a lot more dynamics to herd population I think everybody recognizes, which is why we need to do a much better job of monitoring, because if we truly want to balance the grams of amino acids and get our energy values right for transition cows and fresh cows and high cows, we've got to do a better job here, right? And I just told you guys this, 1993 it was 1474, 2016 it's about 1777, 1771. They're just a lot larger, right? So I was surprised when I learned this, because I didn't think we could change mature size that much over time. There's a whole other discussion in here that just says we really need to do a better job of monitoring, okay? Here's why, and here's why I call this the value added. I work with the Dairy Fellows program, as Mary Ann said. We get to analyze lots of herds with students. In the last few years, I've had a lot of questions about, why farms can't find their milk production. And this is one such farm. So, and this, there's more than one, believe me. We don't have time to get into that. But the bottom line here is that what you see is, this is a herd. Here are the third lactation cows, the second lactation cows, and the first lactation cows, right? Well, first lactation cows should be making about 80% of the mature size of the herd if everything's working right. In this particular case study, and like I said, we've had several others, the veterinarian called me and said, you got to find the milk. The nutritionist called me and said, you guys got to find the milk. The herdsman said, you got to find the milk. The extension agent said, you got to find the milk. The farm owner, the herd managers, they all said, you got to find the milk. We looked at everything. Awesome calf program, got them pregnant at the right time. Man, they did not monitor those heifers after they got them pregnant, right? These heifers are peaking at 69% of the mature cows. Overall lactation, 69% of the mature cows. 5 out of 6 case studies in the last 2 years all had the same problems. I've talked to other people about this. I've talked to other nutrition groups about this now. They've gone out and done their own evaluations. In the Northeast, this is a fairly ubiquitous problem. There's a lot of this going on. So because we're not monitoring, not only can we not balance the diets appropriately, we're missing the opportunity for milk. And what we've learned is that if you don't meet that benchmark of 82%, you're actually going to do whatever your percent of body weight is. And here's 12 herds, only one is above 80%, and this is a false positive because the mature cows in this herd actually were doing poorly, so it made the heifers look better. Only one really did it. Everybody else is basically producing whatever they were as a percent of mature size when they calved in. So that looks like a really good proxy for what they're going to do in lactation, right? And we've looked at enough herds now that we're feeling pretty comfortable about this. So if they calve it at 70% of the mature size, they're probably going to make about 68 to 70% of the mature cow milk, all right? And there's really nothing you can do about it because they got to grow up yet. But it does hurt if they're a large percent of the herd. This is Sam's data from his own research study where they calved in at 79% of the mature size of the herd, and they made 78% of the mature cow milk production, right? So we've looked at this now in several populations over many years, and we see this pretty much everywhere we go. So hitting that benchmark's really important. So this whole thing about body weight and heifers, it's not just about balancing the diet, it's really about also optimizing productivity in the herd, and if we can't do this, we're going to lose it. And in low milk price cycles like we're in right now, this really, really hurts, okay? I have a lot of calculations here, and I want to stop here in just a minute because I want to make sure we've got time for some questions. But we've done the economics on this. Hopefully AMTS will share these, Marianne will share the slides with you. We've looked at income over feed costs and the value of this monitoring. You know, it can be tens of thousands of dollars for a herd. And again, right now, in a low milk price cycle, not doing that is a real penalty, you know. And this herd at $20 milk, it was $100,000. At $16 milk, it was $86,000. It doesn't, that margin doesn't go away. We started looking at herd demographics. Now we're seeing very young herds, right? That's a problem. And then we're looking at when they start to break even, and this is even more problematic because we're seeing herds where the average lactation is 1.7, the average herd life is 45. Their break point on when they start to pay back is 46, all right? And this is a real herd. So there are all these opportunities out there related to the heifer program. It starts with getting body weights and the right kind of information to formulate, but then it plays out into the lactation. So with that, Marianne, I'll stop and do questions.
All right, Mike, I suspect that people won't mind if you want to finish out. Unless you're really cramped for time, and I know you're very busy this week. So
no, I can finish.
Yeah, I think people don't mind that at all. We've gone over the hour mark many times before. So go ahead. I'm going to mute again.
All right. Yeah, so I'll just back up to this. So one of the things, thank you, Marianne, and thank you, everybody. One of the things we've started to do more on the management side, but it's the outcome of everything we try to do with these heifers to grow a quality heifer, get to the right body weight and do everything, is start to look at their, I don't really care about culling, but culling plays into this. What do the heifer demographics look like? This is why I call this the value-added section. Because what we're seeing, at least in the Northeast and the U.S., we had really high cull cow prices for a while, so a lot of cows left the herd. This is a herd somewhere in the Northeast here. I can't tell you where it's at. The herd is 52% heifers, and which is extremely high by what we think they should be, you know, somewhere between 35 and 42, maybe 45 at the upper end. So they culled heavily. They got a lot of heifers. They had a lot of heifers coming. They didn't lose a lot of heifers. But what that means is they've got very low average lactation, right? Well, this is a problem if you didn't meet your benchmark, because now you've got heifers calving, if you've got heifers calving at less than 80%, now you're taking a hit on milk production. And we actually started to look at what that costs, you know, and, you know, in this particular herd, I'll just go to the bottom line down here, you know, in this particular herd, it was about a $1,900 loss in the first lactation, given their level of milk production, the cost of everything to do. And these are the best financial numbers we can get. And these are the numbers that, you know, Jason Carsey's was working with us on this, so we feel pretty comfortable about what these costs are, right? And then you layer that on this, where you look at, you know, the heifer calves, you know, the heifer's born, all right, she gets to this point, now she's going to calve. She's cost you these are real dollars, she's cost us $2,301, and this isn't just a heifer, this is the cost of all the heifers. She pays back something during the lactation, but we still only got minus 100, or still minus about $2,000. And then she crosses the line up here. Well, she crosses this line about the time that she breaks even. Granted, we could put the cow price on here, and she probably crosses the line maybe somewhere about here. So she's going to make some money. But the implication here is that she made the money not on milk yield, she made the money on her salvage value, right? And I have people arguing with me that I shouldn't be talking about this, but I think this is pretty telling that when we make these kinds of decisions, or we aren't looking at this on a systems basis, that we're accepting that we're going to cash flow on milk and our profit's going to come from the sale of the cull cow. Farm Credit in the Northeast or Farm Credit around the country has said this for years, where they will say in their blue book and their summary book, you know, most family living comes from the value of the cull animals. And that sounds exactly like the distillers industry, where, you know, or the ethanol industry, where ethanol basically cash flows and they make all their money, a lot of their money on the sale of the distillers, right? So it's an interesting dynamic. It's one that I'm encouraging people to look at, because I think in these types of situations, we're probably maybe making some wrong decisions. And again, we can get into that, but I encourage people to start looking at it this way on more of a systems lifetime basis. You know, we used to talk about production per day of life, and we don't do that anymore. I think that's probably a mistake, and we probably need to go back to looking at those functions, because I think it's probably playing into some of our long-term profitability. It doesn't mean the dairies aren't making money, but we probably have opportunities to make more money if we think about this more on a systems basis. All right, and I've done some of those calculations here. But that does beg the question, when should we calve animals? So I'm going to show you two data sets now that ignore this whole target growth system and meeting these benchmarks. They're just observational studies, but large population studies, right? Because we've asked the question, when and how early should you calve animals, and does that have a positive or negative impact on lifetime productivity and lifetime milk yield? This is an older data set that we generated here. Bob Everett and I were going, Bob Everett was a geneticist, and we were going back and forth on some of these things, and geneticists always want to use MEs and adjust based on age of first calving, and I kept telling them that was a false adjustment, because all you're really trying to say is for an older animal, they're closer to the mature body weight, because age is your only proxy, because you know nothing about relative maturity based on physiologic growth or chemical maturity and body composition. So what we did is we went back and looked at 2.5 million first lactations, 940 herds from the Northeast and California, did it all on a within herd basis, accounts for management, environment, and genetic differences among farms. Again, using the same statistical procedure, the same mathematics that you'd use for a sire summary. That led us to opportunity groups, so we call opportunity groups. What we did is we set every herd average age of first calving to 0, and then we looked at every herd by standard deviation. And that leads to something like this. So the average of the entire data set, the average age of first calving was 25.6 months. We set that to 0, and then we looked at plus and minus 2 standard deviations. So if you go minus 2 standard deviations, you're at 23.3 months. 1 standard deviation, you're at 24.3. Plus, you're at 27. Plus 2, you're at 30. So this gave us our groups, because now we could look at these animals within herd relative to when they calved. So it's a residual analysis. We did the same kind of thing to milk production. I'm not going to show you all that in the interest of time. But what we have here is productive days and the difference from the mean. So these are the animals calving at 25.6 months, which was the 0 line. Again, this is a residual analysis. These are the animals 2 standard deviations away on the negative side, -1, plus, and +2. And you can see that the animals calving at 23 months, all right, 3 years, all right, this is productive days, difference from herd mean, 50-some days, 60 days ahead, about 40 days ahead. They're behind about 50 days. These guys are behind about 130 days. The important point here is that even if you go out to 6 years, which is beyond where most of our animals get today, they don't catch up. The older animals don't catch up in productive days. The younger animals don't lose productive days. What we learned in this analysis is younger animals, that herd life and productive days is really driven by age of first calving, because they tend to leave the herd at about the same time. So if you calve them older, they're still going to leave the herd about the same time, which means their productive days are decreased by hanging on to them for a while. Then we looked at total milk production in pounds and the difference from the mean. Again, the residual analysis, here's the mean, 1 standard, 2 standard deviations, negative, plus, and plus. And you can see, again, you come out here to 6 years, the older calving animals never made it up in total milk production difference at any stage, and the younger ones, there was some heavier culling in the California herds, which is why you see this kind of negative slope, but they don't really, start touching each other until about 7 years, and there's nobody really around anymore that are out that long, okay? So the bottom line is, for most of the groups that we're working with, we're working in this block, younger age of first calving, those younger animals are always more productive. Those of you out there that are listening that are 50 years or older like me, I can still work a long time, but I don't work as intensely in a short burst like I used to when I was 25. So I understand this. Younger animals can always get more work done. Younger guys can always get more work done. Younger people. It doesn't mean that we're not functional, but, you get my point. So younger animals, more productive, longer herd life, tied to age at first calving. What's fun is that somebody else asked the same question. And this came out a couple years ago in Professional Animal Scientist, Wisconsin DHI data, kind of a fun paper. 69,000 heifers were analyzed. They stratified their herds by production level or productivity. 3X milking high to 28,000 pounds, 3X milking medium about 25,000 pounds, 2X medium about 25,000 pounds, and then 2X low about just over 20,000 pounds. So the way they characterize these herds, these 2X lows are stanchion tie stall herds. 2X medium are probably freestall herds, but not really progressive. 3X medium, more progressive for whatever reason, just not maximizing milk. And then you've got the really high-end herds, right? So they looked at age of first calving relative to these two parameters. So here's exit age. So this is total days by age of first calving, 2X, 3X, right? And for the most part, the lines all go the same direction, right? There's really not here's the 3X. So here's a 3X high here. Here's the 3X medium here. Here's the 2X medium. And you see the 2XL. So they're, length of time, roughly about the same. You're looking at 100 days or so difference here at the end. But the line all tends to go the same. It just says that, total exit time is really not a whole lot different among these things. But exit age is not the most relevant point. The most relevant point is how productive were you while you were there, right? So then they looked at herd life, and they characterized that by days milked by age of first calving. And you know what? It's just the opposite. So when you look at herd life by age of first calving, what you see is a regression line that kind of goes this way, right? And whether, there's some variation in here, the 2X medium and the 2X lows, they're down in here someplace, whereas the 3Xs are kind of up here. So there's about 50 days difference between them, but basically the slope of the curves are about the same. And it said herd life or days milked are directly related to age of first calving, and younger calving animals always have, just like the previous data set, which was very different. Younger cages at first calving have more days milk, so more productive days. And then if you look at lifetime milk, here's our 3X high, here's our 3X medium, here's the 2X medium and the 2X low, all right, by their standards. Same kind of behavior. Basically, it says, hey, you know what? Looking at lifetime milk, older animals are not more productive. In fact, the trend line is probably negative. But if you want to maximize lifetime productivity, you want to calve them as young as possible. I will tell you, you want to meet the benchmarks because you'll probably attain more milk for body weight, that is. But it basically says, hey, you know what? This is especially important right now with a low milk price cycle. If you got heifers that are going to calve at older ages and you don't need those heifers to maintain your herd size, it's time to get rid of them because it says, you know what, they're never going to turn out to be anything better they may be a little bit worse because they don't last as long, depending on which data set you look at. But the bottom line is that younger animals are going to give you more productive days and more milk, more lifetime milk. Either way you cut it, there's no reason to hang on to those animals that are calving in later because they're going to cost you too much money. All right, so we have to come up with different culling strategies. We looked at this in some herds in New York. Again, we've done lots of analysis of farms here lately for different reasons. There's a lot on this slide. The bottom line is this last, we've got the number into the herd and the age of first calving here, but really it's the net margin per heifer completing. That's really what I want to get to in the interest of time. And you can see that, the range and age of first calving, this is a fairly high performance herd. When you know more about the herd, their range was 21 to 27 months age of first calving. You can see the number of animals entering. This is over a year. All right, and you can see their characteristics. The bottom line is, in this herd, all right, their age of first calving was roughly about 23 months. But there's a distribution around that, of course, and there's quite a tail here, right? So again, back to culling animals, when you put the dollars and cents to it, the net margin per heifer completing was maximum or optimized at 22 months age of first calving, and the next highest number when the animal's calving at 21 months, so it's 21 to 22. Look what happens by the time you get to the mean. You're at 134, 113, 219, 4, and 7, right? So it basically says, you know what? Under the current economic conditions, we want to get these heifers in as early as possible to optimize our return on investment and our net margins. We can't afford to be hanging on to animals that are going to calve later. We just can't afford the carrying days, right? Because they're just not going to pay back that much, right? We can move them on and bring in other animals. So in summary, productive days and milk is greater for heifers with lower age of first calving. Economic analysis indicates that lower age of first calving is more advantageous, again, for days of productive life and for profitability. The thing that's hidden in here that I didn't talk about is lower age of first calving requires fewer replacements to maintain the herd size, and that inventory right now has huge financial and significant implications for dairies. We just don't need to be carrying heifers that we don't need or heifers that are going to hang on for a while before they calve in. So the inventory costs in the background are a real killer right now. And then, you know what, if you can achieve the benchmarks for growth, we know that that's going to enhance productivity and profitability. So what we have to do is we have to marry both concepts. We have to calve them as early as we can, but we need to do the best job we can at meeting those benchmarks for growth because we know that's going to optimize that first lactation. Okay, Marianne, I'm done now.
Okay, Mike. So I'll do a couple things. If people will start preparing their questions, that will be great. I want to introduce our next webinar. We'll be hosting Dr. Charles Sniffen, a nutritionist and former professor who coincidentally was my de facto advisor many, many years ago. Charlie is president of Fencrest, a consulting firm for the dairy industry. Prior to his present work, Charlie was president of Minor Agricultural Research Institute, professor and Meadows Endowed Chair in Dairy Management at Michigan State University, professor at Cornell University, and professor at the University of Maine. His talk next month will be about optimizing rations for transition and lactating cows based on fermentable carbohydrates. Please note that we have a change of date for next month's webinar. August is quite a complicated month for many people, and it will be on Tuesday, August 9th at the usual time. We want to take this moment to thank the people who made this possible: Tom Tolucci and AMTF USA and Global, Marcos Neves Pereira, University of Lavras, Marcos Hens Ramos, 3R Lab Brazil, and Paula Torillo in Argentina, who has a bevy of people helping her today because she's traveling throughout the U.S., as well as our translators in each location. Our generous sponsors make it possible for us to get great speakers and manage the program. We want to thank our gold sponsor, Ajinomoto Heartland, superior nutrition through amino acids. Our silver sponsors are Arm & Hammer, Animal Nutrition, Virtus, makers of Strata with EPA and DHA omega-3s, and Prequel with omega-6s. Bronze sponsors are Jeffo, Life Made Easier, Dairy One, Forge Laboratory, and Dairyland Laboratories, and Quality Liquid Feed. So all of that gives you time to ask questions. If you will write them in the question and answer window or in the chat window, I can ask Mike, and we'll see what we can get going for conversation. The first question that I have, this is from Donna Wirtz, and she says, are these age at first calving recommendations still just based on being calving at 82% of mature weight or just older? Or is the assumption that the older these animals are, the bigger they are?
Is that, I'm sorry, I'm still trying to, because I hear two things. Is that relative to the data that I showed from Wisconsin and our population set, or is that just general?
The last set of information presented.
All right. So those data are absent any of the benchmarks. That's just population data that they went out and retrieved from the DHI database, just like we did. So there are, there were no recommendations, maybe by passively there was some benchmarks being achieved by certain nutritionists on some of those farms or by the dairies themselves, but that data is all absent from those recommendations. Those aren't recommendations for age at first calving, it's just the observations that were made on those populations. But what was fascinating to me is that our observation was 10 years older than the one that was just presented by the Wisconsin group, and it's basically saying the same thing. So it says that across everything that we do, younger animals are always more productive. So what I tell people for the objective for age at first calving is, younger is always better, but don't take a herd that's poor performing and force them into some younger age at first calving. Right, because you got to help them, you got to help grow them into that management.
Right. Thanks, Mike, for the conference. I think it was very useful. And I just want to make a question here. I think you emphasized well the importance of measuring body weight. And what would be practical recommendations like frequency and what to use to tape cows or to use a scale, and how you define the body weight of the first lactation animals when post-calving you weight them? Just practical things. How would you implement those things in the herd? Assuming it's really very important, and if we talk about precision feeding and we don't have body weight, it's kind of a strange thing.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So how often? So let me answer one question first. So on the post-calving body weight for the first lactation, I usually try to take that about 7. Some people want to do it immediately after birth. I want to do it about 7 days after calving because that gives them a chance to stabilize a little bit. But that's okay. I think getting the weight at any point in the first week to 10 days is going to be fine unless they've gone, had some real postpartum metabolic issue. How often do we want to weigh? Well, whether you need a birth weight or not, I don't know. That's entirely up to the farm. But you definitely need a weaning weight, and I would like one in the middle. This is going to sound very academic, but, I've got people, if you don't at least do a weaning weight, you have no idea how good your pre-weaning program is, and you don't know what your starting point is for the next phase of growth. So we need a weaning weight, whether it's when you move from a hut or the barn to another barn, whatever way they want to do that is good. I think ideally then you probably want another weight after you move them the first time after they've weaned. You probably want another weight about 100 days out, just to know that, after you wean them and you've moved them, are you achieving some sort of a growth objective that makes sense? Because if you're not, you still have time to make some adjustments so you can achieve that weight around pregnancy. And then I'm going to suggest that, you know, based on the mature size of the herd, if you know the mature size of the herd, you probably want to try to get at them somewhere around puberty. So that's probably going to be another 150 to 200 days, give or take, which sounds like a long time, but at least it's giving you a benchmark. And the reason I like that weight is that if you do it right, it sets you up to start identifying the animals that should get pregnant sooner than others, right? Because some are going to grow a little bit faster, so when they hit that 60% of mature body weight, you can get them pregnant. And again, I think most people are really bad at guessing that weight. I know they are. So, you know, 100 days post-weaning, 150 days post-weaning, that puts you at, you know, 250 to 300 days of life. You know, you should be thinking they should be pubertal, and you should be thinking about getting them pregnant, so that's a good benchmark. Once you get them pregnant, then you should know somewhere around when that happens, somewhere in the middle of pregnancy, all right? So if you want to go 4 months out into pregnancy, that's fine. That gives you some idea that you're on your trajectory to meet that 82% of mature body weight. But it also tells you that if the environment's bad, you may have to adjust your energy levels just to keep them growing appropriately, especially if you've got cold weather. And then obviously when you bring them into the barn and getting them ready to calve, you know, as a close-up animal, I'd like to have a weight on them just to have some idea of what's going to happen. So, you know, more information is always better. What I just gave you is kind of that would be my wish list on any dairy. If I could get that kind of information, that would be helpful.
Could you develop a little bit on body weight gain and mammary gland development? How is this viewed? How is this idea of excessive gain and like the anatomy, this story?
I have that's a great question. I have a whole talk on that. So we published, so body weight gain and mammary development. It's a complicated story. And I didn't put those slides in here because it takes a little bit to set up the context for it. So the original mammary development work that sent us down the wrong path came from the Sinha and Tucker data that was published in 1969. And they showed three distinct rates of growth for the prepubertal heifer. They showed isometric, then the allometric period, and then in the peripubertal period, they went back to isometric. And once they got pregnant, it was allometric. For years, and then Chris Sierson came along and started pulling blood, and, you know, Alan Tucker was on his committee and a bunch of other people, and they measured BST, or they measured somatotropin, not BST, they measured somatotropin, and they found very strong correlations between somatotropin and mammary development. Well, but they had the physiology backwards. When nutrition's low, when energy intake's low, somatotropin levels are higher. When energy's higher, somatotropin levels are lower because it doesn't have to do as much regulation. But we made that link, so for years we thought, you know what, we got to chase this regulation. So we looked at IGF-1, we looked at all the binding proteins. We pulled the mammary gland apart, but we still couldn't solve the problem of why does the mammary gland appear to go backwards when we put in faster growth rates. So we asked the question, this was Matt Meyer's real work, and I'm happy to share this data with you. I'll send you the papers if people haven't seen it. So we asked the question, what does the mammary gland really grow like? But we started the animals at birth, and we harvested them every 50 kilos. So all the way up to 350 kilos. So we had not only the overall growth rate, but we had the interval growth rates of the mammary gland. Plus, we did BRDU labeling, so we knew protein synthesis, so we knew cell development, right? So we had all sorts of markers. The bottom line is if you just did the calculations like everybody else had done ahead of us, there was a decrease in mammary development when you increase growth. However, when you looked at the interval growth, 50 to 100 kilos, 100 to 150, and the like, mammary development was actually the same between the two sets of heifers. when you looked at the BRDU data, mammary development was highest in the animals fed the most milk replacer, and then after they were weaned, it was the same all the way out to puberty. So what we figured out is that mammary development, being a reproductive organ, grows at a predetermined rate of gain, and it was 5.9 milligrams of DNA per day, right? So if you knew that, you could predict what the growth rate was going to be all the way out. So we did that, and basically what we found is when you took day out of the equation, when you accounted for time, mammary development was the same. It's just that the heifers that grew faster had less time. The question is does that affect milk yield? So if you go to the data that's available where they did pair-fed studies, that CLA data that I showed you, we did pair-fed studies. CLA reduced mammary development by 60% in that one treatment, but the heifers that went to lactation made the same amount of milk. Right? What we learned in that study, and there's 3 other studies very similar to that, is that mammary development, as we measured it at puberty, does not negatively impact milk yield. Right? Because the mammary gland knows how to compensate for that little bit of growth. It's a very, very small percentage of the total growth of the gland. If you plot that prepubertal growth as a percent of the DNA in the gland at lactation, it's less than 3% of the total development of the gland at lactation. So it's a very finite thing. Okay, so there's no real relationship there. It's a reproductive organ. It grows like all reproductive organs. It grows as a percent of body weight on a predetermined rate and not as a percent of nutrient intake. There is a caveat to that in the milk-fed calf, and that's a whole other discussion, but the milk-fed calf, in the neonatal calf, the most nutrient-responsive organ in the body is the mammary gland. And that, we're working on a paper right now. We've got the data. 7 parenchymal development is enhanced 6 times. Growth rate was 6 times faster in animals fed more milk replacer than animals that were restricted. And what we've learned between the Meyer study and the Soberone study, and this is now borne out in a couple others, is that allometric growth rate, the isometric allometric switch in early life, actually, that Sinha and Tucker showed was not normal. Those animals that they bought from a sale barn, and they were restricted on their intakes. What we find is if we feed a calf what mom intended it to have from birth, the mammary gland is actually already in allometric growth. So there's a whole dynamic in that pre-weaning phase, but I don't have time for that now.
Mike, I have so many questions that follow up on everything you just said. I'm going to do one from Argentina, and this is through Paula Elenes. In an article you wrote in Hordes, you emphasized whether mom is always right. Is it possible that the effect of the gender on the newborn cow plus the use of an accelerated growth program may condition the future production of heifers? That's a fun one.
Yeah. So the answer to that question is yes. We're firm believers in that, and we have data to that point. And Jim Drakely had talked about calves before, so I didn't want to go back there, and I'm not sure what he showed, but we have lots of data. There are lots of data in the world now that clearly demonstrate that what mom would normally do, and my point there wasn't that some guys interpreted, or some people interpreted what I said in that article as we all got to put the calves back or the calves back on the cow, and that's not the point. What I was trying to get across is that mom wants to nurture the calf. All mammals, all humans want to nurture their offspring, and they want to make them better. That's part of the process. All moms, I can anthropomorphize a little bit and say, all cows want their calves to be better. All humans, mothers want their offspring to be better. Their way of doing that is through the things that they either communicate to them while they're in utero, or the communication that they give to the calf or the neonate while they're lactating. And there's evidence for this in pigs, there's evidence for this in humans, there's evidence for this in primates and in sheep. So the calf's not unusual here. We just haven't taken the time to look at it. So yeah, mom knows that if she's carrying a heifer, she's going to make more milk for that heifer because she wants her to be more anabolic. She puts things in colostrum to help the calf be more anabolic. She puts insulin in colostrum because that calf can actually make use of that insulin, not to do glucose regulation the way you and I think about it, but actually there's insulin-sensitive glucose transporters on the mucosal side of the intestine at birth, and the insulin in the colostrum will actually help drive the uptake of the glucose and the nutrients out of the gut, and calves that are fed more colostrum have higher circulating levels of glucose at 1 day, at 2 days, at 3 days, and 4 days. So the function actually goes on for several days post-birth. So yes, I would say the answer is yes. Mom really wants to nurture the calf. I make a joke about that because most dairy producers will agonize over sire selection, right? They'll have every sire book known to mankind, and they'll, spend hours and hours and hours picking semen to make this outstanding calf. But then the calf is born, and we kind of put it through these pretty average management conditions, yet we agonized over the selection of their sire. So why the dichotomy in the behavior, right? If you're going to spend that much time figuring out how to make a high genetic merit animal, why don't you treat it like the genetic merit animal that you really hope for? And because that's what mom would want. And that's really what I meant by that article.
Okay, Mike, I have another one, and this is from Mark Stocking. I have a producer who is restricting feed access for bred heifers. After how many hours of empty bunk should we be concerned?
So Mark, I'm okay with that if it's a high forage diet. So there's a dairy in Western New York that I've worked with since 1992. The guy has been a true pioneer in forage quality. He's done more of his own on-farm research to make high-quality forages. The idea of a low-quality forage just doesn't exist on his farm. And his veterinarian insists that they're going to feed rumensin to all the heifers. So you take a pregnant heifer with outrageous high-quality silage, and you put rumensin on top, and you get way too much energy. So since 1993, his pregnant heifers have received what is about a 98% forage diet, and they have it for about 12 hours a day. So the constraint that he has, though, is he can never overcrowd his heifer barn, right? And he's managed to do that. We've just built more space for them as he's grown his herd a little bit. So as long as it's a high forage diet and they can consume enough forage in 12 to 14 hours and still have enough left to chew, because there's going to be plenty there to chew on and ruminate appropriately, I think everything is fine. We've been down as low as 4 hours. In some research that we did, we never really talked about it. We published the papers, we didn't talk about the level of intake. When you get down below 10 hours, what we found is that the heifers performed okay, even on a high forage diet, but they cribbed like crazy, worse than any horse you'll ever see. Sucked up all their bedding and cribbed all the wood. So 10 to 12 hours is really the limit that we see on most of those types of diets. But again, bunk space, headlock space, whatever it happens to be, has to be pretty good, and they can't overcrowd too much.
So this is from Robert Corbett. If you breed by weight only, wouldn't you have animals that are small and fat getting bred too early? Wouldn't it be helpful to have the weight along with height to make sure the animals are the right size to breed?
Yes, Bob, in an ideal world, that would be great. All I want the industry to do first is to try to weigh them. Because I can tell you the percentage of herds where we're not getting weight is tremendously high. So the idea of getting stature is, I don't even ask that question, although people say, well, it's easy just to put a line on the wall. But what I find back to the science side of this, and I didn't put those slides in here, and I got to find them. So we did a study. Miner did a study, and we did a study on heifer growth. And again, this comes down, not huge numbers. I know, Bob, you have a very large data set from some of the herds that you've been working with, so my hat's off to you. But when you look at the range around stature within a herd, and you look at the range around body weight within a herd, what you find is the range around stature is about a quarter, in a lot of herds, is about a quarter of what the range is around body weight. Right? And so in terms of a decision tool, I'm still not convinced that adding stature to this measurement is going to give us that much more information than just having a body weight initially. Maybe eventually we can get around to refining that. If we could scan every animal, through some sort of a system, I would say that would be great, but that's way beyond most dairy producers. Great for feedlots, great for some heifer growers. So yes, in an ideal world, I'd love to have stature, but in the data sets that we've generated in terms of real decision making, there wasn't as much variation around stature when you did enough repeated measures as much as there was in body weight, right? So for that reason, but again, I'm going to come back to the practical side of this. Well, we just don't have enough people measuring body weight, period, right? And I need average daily gain. So yeah, on a decision-making basis for pregnancy, some of that might be helpful, but we got to get some real data going.
I just have one more, and so we need to leave. Marcelo has called.
Okay.
And Mike, I would like to have your opinion about what would be a reasonable goal for lifetime milk production in today's Holsteins. I think in your Wisconsin data it showed it ranged from about 60,000 to 80,000 pounds. It would be like 27 to 36 kilograms in a lifetime. What would you consider a goal, a reasonable goal for today, like 40,000, 50,000? What have you seen from that?
That's a really good question. So I've seen really high numbers. So the numbers that I showed in the slides, and I don't know if I can go back to. All right, I'm just going to back. Oops, I went too far. Yeah, so we've got these animals here, at 80,000 pounds. We've seen animals calving in that 22, 23 months. The high end that I've seen so far, but I haven't really been looking for this. But in my casual observations, 120 to 140 is not an outlier. And again, I think part of that comes down to some of the ways that herds do economic decision making, right? And our problem around here is that for a couple years, with the decrease in the size of our beef herd, dairy cattle filled in a big gap in meeting the meat requirements, or the beef requirements to meet just the market. Right? So our cull cows were extremely valuable. So people made culling decisions that weren't probably appropriate. So that's affected some of the decision making here, and we have pretty low lifetimes. But 120, 130, I think is probably a reasonable range. Can we do better than that? I think the answer is yes. But it gets kind of complicated because now you get into some other types of management systems.
Marcos, you said you had no more questions. Yeah. I'm going to let you say goodbye to Mike.
Okay, Mike, thanks a lot, and I think it was a very nice talk. See you soon around.
All right, thank you. See you guys.
Thanks, Marcos.
Good night.
Okay, we have some more questions here on our side. I'm going to go to a question from, I actually have two. Al-Zahal. First one is, when are we going to see updated guidelines for Cncps 6.5 for growing animals?
I'm not laughing at the question. I'm laughing at my time budget. That's very high on my to-do list. So we'll get that done here soon, Hassan. That's we had a training session, like I said, a month ago, and that was one of the primary requests. And I'm just finishing up 3 graduate students this week, so we've been busy writing dissertations. So as soon as I get that done and clear some things, I'll get back to doing some of the stuff for Cncps. Our objective now that we're kind of getting to the end of the road on 6.5.5 and some of the changes we're going to make as we get ready for version 7, is we're going to put more of those user-friendly things out there to help people make better use of the models, and that's definitely one that's on the list.
Okay, and the second question from Hassan is, age at first calving 23 months at 82% mature body weight versus age at first calving 26 months at 82% mature body weight. Any difference with respect to milk yield in the first lactation?
No, we've actually done some casual studies and comparisons where we had herd data. There's no difference. You know, that part's actually, which is why I showed that one. That's why I showed that one study. Right. Oh yeah, here. That's why I showed you this data. So when we not this particular slide, this one, when we can account for percent of mature body weight, age becomes which is why I spent some time on this. Age becomes pretty irrelevant in the calculation for milk yield. It really comes down to what percent of physiologic maturity is the heifer at the time of calving, and that's going to dictate then, you know, that's her frame size. How much can she consume? Because if she's at a lower percent of mature body weight, she doesn't have as much capacity, and she's going to have a higher requirement for nutrient partitioning towards growth. So she's not going to make as much milk, and we can explain most of the variation in first lactation milk production once we have that information, and that's really been the most powerful thing here in the last couple of years, is being able to use that kind of data. You know, once we have it, is to be able to use that data to help herds make better decisions, right? Because it's that data I was showing you from those herds, really this kind of stuff, you know, we've done 6 herds with the students. 5 out of 6 herds we could explain pretty much all of their loss in milk production based on percent of mature size at calving. All of these herds, here's another 12 herds. For the most part, we could help these herds figure out why they weren't making milk, and it all had to do with not meeting that percent mature size. So as long as you do the same thing, what it means, though, is that at 26 months versus 22 months, the animals at 26 months probably are not going to have as much lifetime milk production because they're going to leave the herd about the same age, which means you lost that opportunity for 4 months worth of milk.
Okay, I have a question from Paula for Argentina. According to your studies and experiences, which would be the optimal daily weight gain in the prepubertal Holstein cattle?
It's a conditional answer on how big they are at maturity, and how early you think you want to calve them. I don't know. I can't. Yeah. So I'm not going to answer your. Sorry, Paula. I'm not going to answer your question. Probably your satisfaction. What I'm going to tell you is that, knowing what I know about average population size, if I just took the average Holstein herd that I'm aware of, that with really a mature size now of about 800 kilos, right? When I look around New York, these cows are pretty big, right? So if I take that as my size, and I say I want to calve at 22 months, boy, from birth to weaning, I want to be hitting about 900 grams a day. Right? I'm not going to average that because the first couple of weeks you're probably not going to achieve that, but I want to end up there, so I'm going to more than double my birth weight. And then once I get them weaned, I'm going to be in that 900 to 1,100 grams a day growth rate. So I'm going to be right around that 2 to 2.2 pounds a day, and I'm going to feel pretty comfortable with that. at least for the first 4 to 5 months. And then as I get towards puberty, I'm going to probably slow it down just a little bit, but not a lot. And I'm okay with that. You know, if you're a smaller frame size, you probably don't, one, you don't need that high of a growth rate, and two, you probably wouldn't want to do it anyhow too much, right? Earlier, yes. As you hit towards puberty, now you want to slow them down a little bit.
Okay. Mike, I don't have any more questions in any of my windows. I'm trying to see. So if anybody wants to say anything or have any more comments, they should let me know very soon, or I'll let poor Mike get home to his wife and supper.
Wait,
Tom's on. All right.
Michael, are you going to, is any of that economic data going to get published?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to pull it together. What I want to do, Tom, is build a case study paper to put someplace that does the herd life, economics, and breakpoints. We've got enough data now. You know, I just have to, like everything else, I got to figure out how to spend enough time on it to actually make it coherent.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful data, and people have to start thinking this way.
Yes. You know, well, I'm going to try. Don't know where to put it yet, but probably, you know, I'll try JDS in our industry today or something like that. But if you've got another suggestion.
Okay. Tom, anything more?
I'm good.
All right. Mike, thank you so much. We're really happy that you could join us for the second time in our series. You were our premier event last year, and now you're following up with whole growing heifer information. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember that the date will be different next time. It's going to be Charlie Sniffen. It's not on the 10th of August. It's on the 9th of August. Mike, thanks for joining us. And everyone else who joined us, thank you very much. I don't think I have any more questions. None have appeared. So I'm going to let you go. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
All right.
Everybody.
Good night, everybody. Bye.